least. We need to talk more about regions outside of Europe. I don't think we have done enough of that. Anyway, to do that for us today, we'll have a presentation by Florian Kern, who is a senior lecturer, also known as associate professor in the UK system at the University of Essex in the UK. And at the department was Michael Nicholson Center for Conflict and Cooperation. And this is not in this bio, but Florian was also a student here at SAIS many years ago.
Maybe not that many.
Not that many. Well, relatively. Okay, relatively.
Yes.
When in 2008, 2009, you said.
It is
15 years ago, he was a student here. So welcome back to SAIS. Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, I was indeed a student here 15 years ago. Oh yeah, I'll need a microphone. Take this one for now, and then I'll walk around. Usually, I walk around a lot, so I may change microphone. Is that okay? I'll walk around. Okay. Okay. Here, and I'll maybe sit down in the beginning, and then I stand up and stuff and go to the podium. Yeah. So I'm an associate professor at the Department of Government at Essex now. I was here 15 years ago. It's really weird to be back like this, yeah, because usually I was sitting there, yeah, but now I'm here. I also my flight just got canceled, so I guess I'm stuck here for a couple of days, which is not so bad. My wife will not agree, I think, but she's also a SAIS grad, so I met my wife here as well, right? So there's a lot of sort of stories about this as well. You can ask me about that too if you want to in the Q&A. Let's see what we get, yeah. But for now, and anything else you can ask me as well. Also afterwards, if you want to, about like whatever my trajectory since then, yeah, 15 years ago. I did the mistake yesterday already when I was talking to somebody, because I was sort of presuming that I've been here 10 years ago, and then that person pointed out it's already 15 years ago. So it's been a while, yeah. I work mostly on African politics. I've done that already during my time at SAIS, both in Bologna and in DC, and that's what my research is on. And today I'm presenting work that is joint work with two colleagues at Essex, Martin Steinwand, who's a senior lecturer at Essex, and Samira Diobire, who is one of my PhD students, who's originally from Burkina Faso, but actually grew up in Italy here as well, in Lecco, of all places. So Samira and Martin and I have been working on this project for about 2 years now. Martin and I maybe a little bit longer. Okay,
I'll actually go there, so then I can see you and
change this. So what is this project about, or what is the presentation about? I'll give you a bit of background and information about this research project that I'm working on. A bit of theoretical explanations as well. Then we go into methods, research design, just sort of to explain to you how we get at this all analytically. And then I'll conclude with a couple of conclusions, and then you can ask me questions about the research, the general topic area, if you want to. I type myself for about 30 minutes, let's see, and you can interrupt me if you want to after 30. Yeah. So what's the background of the motivation here? Well, as social scientists, we're sort of assessing that people power is rising in Africa over the last decade, right? What does that mean? People express their voice to the powers that be, to their governments, increasingly so, not just through elections, but also through activism, rioting, demonstrating, mobilization in social media and so forth, right? There's various pathways through which Africans are starting to
since you said 30 minutes, I said it.
For 30 seconds. Okay, good. We're observing this, right? That people are voicing their demands to their leadership more and more, right? And obviously that triggers sort of an analysis of public opinion, right? What are people thinking, right? And where in Europe and in sort of when we're studying industrialized countries, right? Obviously this is the realm of political science, right? We look at public opinion, and we've done that in Europe for a long time. In Africa, we've done it since before the 90s, but really in 1999 when the Afrobarometer was introduced, which is the biggest public opinion survey in Africa. That we're now in round 9 of the Afrobarometer, I think it's now 36 countries that are surveyed. The first round surveyed about 8 countries. Yeah. And in the Afrobarometer, we're asking respondents about, their attitudes, their desires, assessments about their lives, but also assessments of policies of their governments, right? But mostly those questions refer to domestic policy, right? Interestingly enough, the Afrobarometer doesn't really ask questions about foreign policy as much, right? So that people assess the foreign policy of their governments. There's a couple of questions there, but as I will argue later also, they are of a specific kind, right? So there's a couple of questions in there that ask about what Africans think about the US, China, Russia. Yeah, it's a very sort of externally focused. These are questions about external actors, right? And in my eyes, they're often less important for Africans than the questions that we're interested in, which is actually questions about Africans assessing their own governments, right, and their own government's foreign policy. I mean, Sergey may disagree that these questions about China and Russia are also very important. And why is that as social scientists or as political scientists, we're sort of ignoring public opinion in Africa when it comes to foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy? I have sort of 3 hunches, yeah, why that's the case. And none of them really great for the social sciences, really. The first one is that we just assume that African governments are strong executives, right? They don't care about their citizens. Right? That's one assumption we're making, right? And because they don't care about what the citizens think, right? They don't have to incorporate citizens' demand in their foreign policy. And ergo, as social scientists, right, we don't have to study that, right? In my eyes, that's an outdated conception of what's actually happening on the continent, right? And it's not just me who's thinking that. The other sort of view that we have across the social sciences is that foreign policy in Africa is driven by external donors, right? USAID, the Gates Foundation, the World Bank, other financial institutions, they move in, they sort of, implement conditional policies, right? Governments have to follow them, and that's the foreign policy right there. That's done and dusted, Constituents don't play a role in that, right? So that's maybe why we don't study that link between constituents and foreign policy. And the third one is the idea of selectorates, right? There's a certain elite, in African countries that really are propping up the government, and we don't really have to care about the populace, right, and their views. Now, I think this is outdated. At the very least, right, we actually don't know what the link is of the general public and foreign policy, right? So by ignoring that, because of this reason, we're actually impoverishing our understanding of what's actually happening on the ground. And there's much anecdotal evidence that foreign policy actually is shaped by, or at least is, that there are demands of the public regarding foreign policy, right? Xenophobic riots in South Africa, right? Those are dynamics that have cross-border ramifications, right? So they will involve governments from different countries, right? Given the demands that people have, for instance, South Africa. If you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a lot of border closures between different countries. Traders were actually protesting those border closures, right? Those are demands that constituents make about cross-border policies that involve 2 governments, ergo foreign policy, right? So really what we're asking a little bit is, well, what about constituency agency in foreign policy in Africa? What about what we refer to typically as the 2-level game, right? Foreign policy is something that is determined both by international constraints and by domestic constraints, right? And while we apply that to when we look at great powers, right? When we look at industrialized countries, for some reason we're only applying half of that to analyzing African countries, right? I think that's a sort of an outdated view of what's happening. There's really not much data at the moment on public opinion on foreign policy. So the research questions, right, coming from the background to the actual research questions of this project, to what extent are attitudes of constituents in Africa reflected in their government's foreign policy, right? So be careful, we're not saying one shapes the other at the moment. We're just saying, this is the position of the government. This is the position of the, of the public on average, right? Are they the same? Are they far away from each other, right? And the second one is, are there subgroups in society that are better reflected in a country's foreign policy, right? Those are the 2 things that I'll try to talk to you about right now in this project that is a bit work in progress, right? So some of the things may not be as refined yet in terms of the data that we have, but we have some interesting insights. we apply this to two interesting issues that have cross-border ramifications that are foreign policy relevant, and that is free movement and free trade. Yeah. Why is that important? Well, first of all, in 2018, the African Union adopted these two agreements on free movement and free trade within the African Union. So it's very timely. It's a very timely issue with clear cross-border ramifications, right? Once has asked questions about it, right? So this is really determined by sort of data availability to some extent as well, right? The round 8 of the Afrobarometer has, between 2019 and 2021, has asked these questions on free trade and free movement. They haven't asked them in the new round, which is a bit unfortunate, because otherwise you could compare over time what's happening. But we're looking at this in 2018 and from 2019 to 2020. Our research speaks to various bodies of works in political science and the social sciences, foreign policy and public opinion, African foreign policy, but also regional integration, the African Union literature on sort of supranational institutions and how they work and how the publics, right, can shape policy and demand for policy change. Okay, so how do we then think that this match between foreign policy position and public opinion, right, is determined? We think that there are two types of explanations here. One are explanations, as I already pointed out, that are sort of national level explanations, right, where the government looks at national factors and sort of shapes national public opinion and sort of shapes policies based on that. And the other would be group level explanations, right? Some groups have certain attributes that lead to the government to have certain positions. And so we have 4 hypotheses, 2 for the national level and 2 for the group level of analysis, right? The first one is very straightforward, and that is the more democratic a government is, the closer the match should be between where they are on foreign policy and where the overall public opinion is, right? And we think that, right, based on democracies, theoretically at least, they should be able to aggregate public opinion better, right? They should take into account what the people want, and ergo should be more representative, right, of in the realm of foreign policy, right? So that's one hypothesis that we're trying to look at. The second one is has to do with what we call unearned income of governments, right? So the more dependent a government is on taxation, right? Taxation being a tool that obviously connects constituents and government in an accountability mechanism, right? You give me money and I have to deliver for that, right? So the more dependent a government is on taxation, as opposed to other income sources for a government, the closer that match will be, right? Alternative ways, sort of if you're not dependent on taxation, right, could be natural resource income, right? If you're Nigeria and you have a lot of oil income, right, you may not depend as much on taxation, right? And so you have more independence from your constituency to some extent, right? So we could presume, right, we are hypothesizing that a country that has a lot of natural resource income that doesn't depend on taxation, that gets a lot of foreign aid, right, that they don't have to listen as much to their constituents, and ergo you could see a bit of a gap in foreign policy in the foreign policy positions of the public and the government. Now we're moving to the group level, right? So sort of to disaggregate on the group level. And here we have 2 hypotheses as well. The first one is that the more affected a constituency group is, the closer the match between that group's public opinion and the foreign policy position. So if a particular group is affected by a particular foreign policy, for instance, they work in a certain sector, right? If you're a trader, as opposed to being a teacher, right, you are probably caring more about certain foreign policy positions. And maybe your government thinks, well, we should really represent those traders over those teachers in foreign policy, right? Or if you live close to a border, right, you have more interactions that have to do with foreign policy, so maybe your opinion matters more. And then finally, this is a very sort of straightforward power politics hypothesis. Some groups in society may just be more powerful than others, and those groups should be represented more, right, ceteris paribus, in a government's foreign policy, right? So we know from analyses using what's called the ethnic power relations data set, which looks at historical institutionalization of power across various African countries. We know that some ethnic groups are in power for a very long time in some countries, and it's relatively straightforward to presume that those ethnic groups then also are better represented in foreign policy, right, as opposed to other ethnic groups. It could also be urban versus rural elites, right? So we could think that people who live in cities are better represented in foreign policy because maybe they have more access to the government than rural people, right? Those four hypotheses we're for now interested in, and I'll try to show you a little bit of evidence on each of these, what we find. How are we designing this? What research design are we using? How do we try to answer that question? How do we try to find support for those hypotheses, right, or falsify them? If you think about this as like two scales, right, and on the one scale you are saying on the same foreign policy issue, you are saying here is where the government sits and here's where the public sits, right? And if you want to be more complex, you think here's where the government sits and here's where the different subgroups in society are sitting, right? So we need to construct those scales, right? And so for the governmental scales, we're actually lucky because the African Development Bank and the UN in 2018 and a couple of years before that, they published the Africa Regional Integration Index, the RE, right? Which in fact places governments on a scale from 0 to 1 on how integrative they are, right, in terms of trade and free movement. Yeah, if you scored a 1, you're very integrative in terms of free movement and free trade. If you scored a 0, you're very sort of reclusionary when it comes to free movement and free trade. Yeah? So we're using those two indices for those two issues for the governmental position. Yeah? I would be careful, I'll repeat this a couple of times going forward, to compare those two issues with each other because the indices are not exactly the same. Yeah, I'll explain more what I mean by that when we go to this. Now we have figured out the first scale, right? We can sort of scale the governments, all African governments or a large group of African governments on their foreign policy positions on trade and free movement, right? And now we need the publics, right? For that, we have the Afrobarometer, as I said, the Afrobarometer round 8 from 2019 to 2021, the data was collected. You can already see this is a very interesting time period, yeah, where they collected this data. Yeah, you all remember this time period. So anyway, there's a bit of an interesting variation in that data. Yeah, it's 32 countries, so they're not collecting data in all African countries for various reasons. Yeah, you can all imagine. But there's two questions there: one on free movement and one on free trade, where people are literally asked, "How much do you agree with the idea that we should freely trade with our neighbors?" Yeah, and that we should freely move across borders. I can show you the questions if you're interested in the actual wording of the questions. I have it on my slides later on. And what we do is we scale this exactly the same, right? So the indices are scaled 0 to 1, and we scale the public opinion on a 0 to 1 scale. So we can just say, this is where the government sits, and this is where the public opinion is. So here's a gap, right? This is where the government sits. This is where the public opinion is. Guess what? They match. Okay? Because usually in the literature, what we're often assuming is that across Africa, right, across countries in Africa, this sorts of match and the sort of opinions and government positions are basically the same across the continent, right? We sort of assume it's sort of like some sort of unique mass, right, of African countries at the African Union. They've all ratified this agreement, right? Or 52 countries of 54 have ratified one of those agreements. So they must all sit on the same position. And then what we do, right, as I just explained to you, basically we have the policy distance, right, between those two parties, and so we have the RE minus the response. Oops, okay. And so that gives us the distance between the two. Now, one thing is quite important and it's sort of a bit complex to understand. As I just pointed out to you, right, we're looking at the distance of the government to the people, right? But there are two types of mismatches, right? The government can be really integrative on trade and the people don't love that, right? That's a mismatch, right? Or the government can be really restrictive on trade, but the people want free trade. That's a mismatch too, right? But absolutely speaking, it's a mismatch in both cases, right? So first, we'll just talk about the mismatch. We don't talk about the complication of it, but I will get into that complication as well because it matters, obviously, right? Because it's qualitatively different if governments overshoot, right? They supply more free trade policy than the people want, right? Or if they undershoot, right? We want free trade, but you're not giving us enough free trade. Okay, so let's look at some data, right? These are just the descriptives of the public opinion, the Afrobarometer question on free movement. Yeah. So from strongly opposed to strongly in favor, and these countries are actually ordered in a very weird direction. This is my colleague Martin Steinberg, who I think is also called. It's sort of like a serpentine. Yeah, you have to imagine it like this. Right? And so that means this in this country, Zimbabwe, in this country, Zimbabwe, the mean public opinion is strongly skewed towards being in favor of free movement. In this country, Botswana, right, another South African country, the public opinion is skewed towards being strongly opposed to free movement. Right? So already, what we can tell from this graph, right? Now, you can choose your favorite country, right? You can look into one of those countries and you can find very interesting things, right? So for instance, in Kenya or in Ghana, right here, you actually see that it's quite polarized, right? You have a lot of people being quite pro and a lot of people being quite contra free movement, right? But you can already tell that definitely what's happening here is that not all countries and not all populations look similar in terms of the distribution of the public opinion on free movement. Right. This is for free trade, right? Exactly the same order based on the means of public opinion, right? Ugandans are very much pro free trade, right? By the way, Ugandans also very much pro free movement, right? Senegalese, Tunisians are very much against free trade, right? On average. There's some very interesting cases here as well. I mean, I don't know if you look at the data more closely. I think it's Lesotho, which, if you look at Lesotho, a tiny country, in Southern Africa, right, landlocked, in fact, I think, on free movement, people in Lesotho are very much pro free movement. But guess what? On free trade, they're actually quite opposed, right? Which must have local reasons, yeah, that we don't go into. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting variants here already, right? Definitely, it's not the case that these types of dynamics sort of apply across the board and are sort of the same, and we can just assume that Africans are pro or against free trade, very different sort of positions in each of those countries. These are the foreign policy positions of the governments based on that index that we have not produced, that we're just taking from the UN and the African Development Bank, right? So a country like Mozambique is very integrative in terms of free movement, right? A country like Ethiopia is very restrictive in terms of free movement. Yeah. There's an interesting variance here in this index as well. It sort of it doesn't really cluster. Whereas on free trade, right? Countries are much more pro-free trade in terms of their policy position, right? Again, I wouldn't necessarily compare those two with each other because the indices are not produced the same way. But if you compare the distributions, right, you can at least say, well, clearly, more countries are sort of clustered in the same position. So there seems to be a bit more of an agreement in this policy. Okay, just descriptives. Yeah. Now we come to the foreign policy match. Okay, so this is now the distance. These are box plots, and what they show is that a country that sits here, like Ethiopia, for instance, right, is basically undersupplying free movement. Right? So in Ethiopia, as we saw before, right, Ethiopia was quite restrictive in terms of free movement, right? But people want free movement. Right? And this is very interesting, in countries like Togo and Mozambique, the governments are oversupplied. Right? People would like have less free movement on average. And the countries where sort of where the median, this is the median now, where the median is close to this orange line, had a relatively good match of policy to public opinion. Explain the candles. So These are box plots. Basically, they show like the different quartiles, right? So this is a 35% quartile. So they also show the distribution of the public opinion.
Okay, right. It looks like the stock market now.
Right. That must be, of course, in statistics here as well, yeah?
Well, I have not taken.
It's fine.
Maybe the wrong course.
Of the three of us, I'm the least expert in these things too. So you're asking like maybe Martin and somebody can chime in later on. But basically, what's important to understand here is again, it's a lot of variance, right? There are countries that are oversupplying free trade, free movement. There are countries that are definitely undersupplying, right? And then there's actually a good group of countries where the match is actually relatively good. And these are not, I mean, if you eyeball it, right, it's not just the democracies. Right? For trade, there's a lot of, at least the way we construct, based on the index that we have, there's a lot of oversupply. What does that mean? Across Africa, at least with the data that we have, you would infer that many governments provide more free trade, are sort of more pro-free trade than their populations are, right? And this sort of shows the same thing. It just I wish it was sort of turned 45 degrees, but basically this shows that if you look at, let's look at Mozambique, right? And you have to assume that this is the distribution that we saw before on people being strongly opposed to people being strongly in favor of free movement in this case, right? And so the orange line is sort of the perfect match, right? So in Mozambique, the government kind of sides with the people who are most in favor of free movement, right? But that's just the relative majority. The absolute majority of people are actually sort of definitely skewed towards less free trade. Again, it's a story of variance in way. That's in the beginning when we do these descriptives, we only want to say it's not the same across the continent, right? There's a lot of variance within each country. If you look at Ethiopia, it's sort of the opposite case again, right? The government sort of sides with the people who are strongly opposed, even though clearly the absolute majority of people are pro-free trade, free movement in this case. And the same for trade as well. I can come back to these graphs if you want to look at one particular country at some point. Okay, so now we know that, what have we sort of shown so far? There is, we have sort of shown some new information, some new measures that show that there's variance across the continent in terms of where the public stand on free movement and free trade, where the government stand on free movement and free trade, although that is based on that index that we didn't produce. But really in the gap between those two, right? Some countries are really good in matching public opinion. Some countries are really bad at it, right? And some are overshooting and some are undershooting. Some are oversupplying, some are undersupplying posts, right? Again, what I'm not talking about, because I'm trying to be careful, is what shapes what, which is a crucial question, right? But we can't really get at this design. We would have to use some qualitative inference, I guess, of some of those cases that I pointed out to you. Yeah. We're just sort of saying, where do they sit? Are they sitting like this? Are they sitting like this? Are they sitting like this? But we want to explain that gap, right? And for that, we're using a sort of more complex model, right? And here, basically a policy match. I think for now, I think what it does, obviously, it takes all of those explanations that I showed you earlier, the ones that are national level explanations and the ones that are group level, individual level explanations, right? And puts them in one model to match sort of the individual's policy match to their government, right? This is one respondent's. This is the outcome variable basically is for one respondent and their match to where the government stands. So we have like 45,000 respondents in the Afrobarometer that we can now test. Here, just so we're clear on what I'm going to show you going forward, right? The more positive the value is of this, the better the policy match is. Okay? It's a bit different than the values before. When this becomes negative, it means that the match is really bad. It's not anymore the overshooting and the undershooting, but we can distinguish that as well. If that becomes really positive, the match is really close. If it becomes really negative, the match is really not so close. And what we find for at least for the data that we have at the moment, for our first hypothesis, so on democracy, right, and whether more democratic states have a better match, right? actually, we don't really find systematic evidence in the data that we use so far that democracies in Africa are better at matching what the mean public opinion wants. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's sort of, I'm trying to carefully formulate this. I don't know if I'm trying to sort of dance around it a bit, right? Because I'm not saying they respond better to their respondents. I'm only saying the match is closer, right? And we can talk about some of those stories that we presume are going on behind, because if you see an autocracy where the match is really good, right? We can think of various mechanisms for why that is the case, right? Maybe people were just afraid to give the Alpha Barometer the right answer, and they were just saying, I better just say what the government wants, right? We're just saying close match. We're not saying they are better in representing their people. Yeah. However, we find a couple of interesting findings when we sort of splice the group up into those countries that are oversupplying free trade or free movement and those that are undersupplying. Yeah? And so what we find, for instance, is that among countries that are overshooting with their trade policy, so they're very open, they're more open than people want, right? The more democratic countries have worse policy match. Okay, so among those that are providing too much trade openness, right, the democracies have the worst match. So that's interesting. It sort of suggests that what's happening is that democracies are not necessarily better in representing. In fact, what they do, they are so liberal, right, that they are more liberal than their populations. Right? And so that shows you that democracies are not just elections, right? Democracies are also about liberal values, right? Liberal market values. So those democracies, they integrate into the international market for various reasons that we went into, right? It could be that they're just more easily integrated by the big states, right, into the international system. But the people actually feel that it shouldn't be so integrated. Yeah. For freedom of movement, actually, you can see this here. We find actually the opposite, right? That among countries that oversupply freedom of movement, democracies have a closer match between preferences and policies. Yeah, but the evidence for the trade is actually stronger. For the idea of unearned income, right? So this was the idea that governments could separate themselves from their constituents if they just get money from something else than taxation, right? We actually don't find any sort of systematic evidence that hypothesis that could support this hypothesis, right? So I can move on. For whether certain subgroups, now we go into the group analysis, for whether certain subgroups are better represented, we actually find that agricultural workers have a better foreign policy match on trade policy. And interestingly, this is now again a bit complex. I hope I get this right. Interestingly, what's happening is that this seems to be driven by observations where overall public opinion thinks that there should be more trade openness. So that seems to be a case. We have to look into this a little bit more qualitatively of basically providing subsidies to agricultural workers, right? The government says, no, okay, you guys are important, so we're not going to be as open so that you can sell at the prices that you want to sell at, and the overall population would actually like there to be more openness and smaller prices, right? So this is clientelistic politics in a way in favor of agricultural workers. Respondents closer to a border have a better policy match on freedom of movement, right? So that's interesting, but the effect is only weakly statistically significant. And urban respondents, there's sort of a complex dynamic going on, have a worse policy match than rural respondents for trade. Right? So for some reason that we still have to get into sort of in terms of mechanisms, this is going on as well. So, and then finally, access to power, right? So are those ethnic groups, for instance, that are more powerful, are they also better represented in terms of foreign policy? So with the data that we have from the ethnic power relations data set that we have incorporated, we actually don't find a relationship for this. Yeah. So it seems like there's no, for the data that we have, no ethnic favoritism in terms of the foreign policy match. Yeah. However, one interesting dynamic that we do find is that when in respondents say in the Alpha Barometer that they feel discriminated against based on their ethnicity, yeah, in the country that they live in, their policy match in terms of free trade is also worse. Right? So that speaks to, that tells you a story of somebody who is not only discriminated based on their ethnicity in their country, but also probably feels discriminated in terms of their economic opportunity, right? In those countries. Okay, so a couple of sort of highlight findings from all of this. It's still, as I said, work in progress a little bit. I think the sort of headline findings to me are the following, right? Or the headline conclusions, right? We didn't know anything about public opinion. That's not what it sounds a bit megalomaniac, but we didn't know much about the match between public opinion comparatively across the continent and foreign policy in Africa, right? Before this analysis, right? Now, at least for two policy areas, free trade and free movement, we see that there's great variance across the continent, right? In terms of public opinion and how it's distributed, in terms of how the policy position is distributed, but also in terms of to what extent governments are actually reflecting what people want or not, right? In both directions. Some first explanations emerge for more or less foreign policy match, right? So it seems like democracies are systematically oversupplying free trade policy, right? Based on our data. Interestingly, if you look through all of our analysis in the paper, which we're happy to share once it's sort of in a presentable shape, we have more systematic findings for trade policy than for immigration, for the free movement policy, right? And we don't really know why that is, right? It could just be that that's empirically the case, but I also have a hunch that they're just very different things, right? So if I, as a constituent, right, me myself as like a political being, right, I probably think that I have a better understanding of what free movement means to me than free trade. Right? I mean, if you go to SAIS, hopefully by the end of your MA degree, you have a very good understanding of what free trade means to you personally, right? But I'm saying, as the average voter, right, I understand that, like, oh yeah, cool, free movement. I don't need a passport. I can just move across this border, right? And so you may have sort of a better information in assessing what the government wants and where you sit, right? Or I don't know. But for the trade, it's much more difficult for you to figure that out. Right. So maybe that's why you sit in very different corners, right? And you actually have more leverage here. And as I said before, I think this is really difficult to, really important to emphasize again and again. We're really only explaining how close they are to each other, right? We're not saying anything yet about whether the government policy shapes public opinion, right? Or whether it's public opinion that shapes government policy. For that, we would need observations over time, and the Afrobarometer doesn't have that, and I don't have the research funds to collect the data myself at the moment, although there is a proposal under review, and so if the Economic Social Research Council is listening, I would like to have that money, please. All right, that's it. Thank you so much.
All right, Florian, thank you very much. I mean, what you've done here is a fantastic, very fascinating presentation for me, not only because it, of course, opens up a new vista for us, Africa, which, as you have said, is understudied, and there's much less understanding of phenomena like the public opinion and the relation between the government policy and public opinion. But I think it also could tell us something about other regions of the world. So, for example, this question that you outlined in your final comment, what drives policy? Is it public opinion, or does the government actually shape public opinion? The same question has been asked repeatedly without any answer about China, for example. And nobody really knows the answer, whether it's a chicken and egg dilemma. Or something like that. So it's I personally found it extremely interesting. What I also liked about this presentation, I hope our students also will agree, is the way you actually presented it here as almost a sample of research. Those of you who are doing research on various subjects, of course, hopefully can talk to you later, because I think this is a very good example of how you formulate hypotheses, how you, in some cases, you obviously fail to find support for your hypothesis and have to revisit the question, how you collect data, and so on. Your final remark about the reliability of data, or the need to collect your own data, is something I've also pondered a lot, because of course when you work with existing data sets, you have to think about, well, how were they formed? Who worked on them? Was there bias involved, or was it something else? Can I incorporate these things into my research without actually taking the same bias into my research? So all of that is really fascinating. One question I have about, to start us off, and then of course we'll switch over to broader discussion with students, is I assume from your presentation that you did not make a difference in your account or did not allow for a difference between liberal and illiberal democracies. Now, the term illiberal democracy, of course, was coined by Viktor Orban in relation to Hungary. But it seems that on some of those issues, at least that you address with regard to free trade, for example, you could argue that you talked about liberal democracies in Africa, but could you also not have a case of illiberal democracies where those countries, those governments that are maybe democratically elected do not feel like they actually have to pursue liberal values in the way that you have described? I wonder what you would say to that.
So, yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think what we are including, obviously, because we're using quantitative data, is we're looking at the quality of governance project data, and we're using a scale of political systems that are scaled from an autocracy to a democracy. So we are sort of incorporating whatever other people have coded in terms of how democratic they think Zimbabwe is as compared to Ghana, as compared to whatever, right? on a scale, right? But yeah, I sort of have two answers to this. One is a bit more sort of a personal interest answer, and the other one is actually the one that I think is interesting here, right? So when I teach my students African politics, the first thing that I ask them usually is like, can you what's the first thing that comes to you? I do like one of those clouds, right? Word clouds, and I ask them, what's the first thing that comes to your mind on the first day when I teach them, right? Or what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about Africa, right? And in 90% of the time, it's all doom and gloom, right? It's all like conflict, autocracy, dictators, right? Not everyone is like this, but on average, right? That's the first thing that people that when I say you only have one answer, right? Type it in your phone and it shows up on the board. Yeah? And so that's interesting to me because I think there's much more variance across the continent, obviously, right? And I do the same exercise at the end of my course, and I ask them the same question, and it's much more varied what the answers are, right? Because Africa is a lot about very boring everyday politics, just like everywhere else, right? And so why am I saying this? Because I think our data, so I think this project also comes out of an interest to say, okay, we really think that democracies are more representative, right? But there's greater complexity within those systems, right? And what our data, at least so far, kind of shows is that, there's actually a relatively decent policy match in countries that are not necessarily the countries in the African continent that we would right away name when we think about democracies in Africa, right? In fact, as I said repeatedly, right, it seems like democracies are systematically oversupplying free trade, right? So people don't want their governments to be this open, their countries to be this open. At least that's how it looks like in our analysis, right? So I think what the project does in that sense, it does something interesting. It sort of treats it a little bit more neutrally and says like, what's the match, right? And guess what? What we see is there are countries that are not as democratic in the usual sense that we think about it, that at least are very close to what the people want, right? No, sorry, what the people reveal in the survey they say they want, right? Because now is the tricky part. The tricky part is obviously to uncover why are people saying this, right? Are they saying this because that's their true preference or over free trade policy? Are they saying this because the government, they're afraid of government repercussions, and so they better just say what the government wants, right? And that we cannot discern, right? So it's just, I guess it's, at least at the moment, we can't, right? If that, so the complexity is there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating, but it also obviously extends beyond Africa's shores. If you think of liberal democratic governments that oversupply certain liberal good where their actual populations does not, their population does not want. I can name a number of countries in the West
Right.
that do that, which actually explains the rise of populism, right?
No,
So
this is sort of, and again, like I'm saying, everyday boring politics. In
I mean,
Africa.
we can look at very
Right.
known countries that have this problem.
Right, exactly. Right. The
I will
country
not,
I'm
I
from,
will
for
not
instance.
name it.
Yeah, exactly. The country that I'm from, for instance, right? But I think, and I think that's oftentimes in this. I'm not the first one to point this out. Right? In my field, which sort of focuses on comparative politics of Africa, right? There is a large movement of people, of scholars from Africa, who have pointed this out for a very long time, right? That we have this sort of for instance, that we take a lot of the models that we have about Western society and we apply them to explain things in Africa. And guess what? This project, to some extent, actually, as you say, says something that you could generalize
About Western society as well, which is kind of interesting. I mean, I find it extremely interesting. Okay, folks, questions? All right, here, take the microphone around. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, yes, I'm Windila and I'm a Maya student, first year student. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question was related to the demographic in terms of education. So did you take that in consideration and did that have an impact on the result that you observed?
That's an excellent question. How can I ask you back? Sorry, that's a bit mean, but I do anyway. How do you think education would shape? Because that's really how we have to think about it, right? So now we want to sort of understand this association, right? So what you're saying is there may be something going on that drives in the education of those respondents, right? That drives the gap between where the government sits and where you are, right? And definitely is something we have considered, probably not as a variable where we're like, that's like one of the main variables we think is driving this relationship, right? But how do you think age could drive that relationship?
Age or education?
Education.
Knowing that the African continent is one of the continents that's the least educated, I feel like education would have an impact because it depends on what kind of people you're asking to and who the education level they might have, especially understanding what trade means and what the policies government.
It's a very good point. It's an excellent point. So I could venture an hypothesis, and we haven't run this analysis, I think. I could venture an hypothesis where I think, for instance, what you're saying is maybe more educated people, right, are better represented in the foreign policy of their countries, right? And why could that happen? Well, you have a science degree, right? You are interested in foreign policy, and you know how that stuff works, how the sausage is made, right? So you are actually lobbying your government, right?
Do you automatically believe in free trade if you have a science degree?
Maybe a couple of years ago you did, Maybe a couple of years ago you did. So yeah, no, it's a very interesting. So usually we think of education as like a control variable, right? But it's a fair point to say like maybe in Africa it's a little more because it's such a systematic inequality in a way, right, in terms of education. Yeah, it's something we could look at, yeah, for sure. I mean, again, like you always have to sort of think about the mechanism, right? So like that's why we came with the hypothesis, and that little gray thing below is sort of the, an hypothesis is nothing but like an X and a Y, right? So like this shapes this, right? But then you have to tell me why that's the case, right? And so one explanation could be, if you are more educated, you are more willing, more informed, and with that information, you're more willing to lobby the government, and you could be better represented. That could overlap with other variables that we're, because if you think about the finding on urban populations, right, it's probably true, although I have no evidence for this, like I ran this in my head right now, it's probably true that urban elites, urban populations are on average more educated than rural populations, right? And so in these findings, that urban populations are better represented, I think in trade, I think it was, that could be the case, right? So we should probably like a control for education, for instance, and see whether that's what's driving the relationship. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Christy and I'm part of the MIPP program. This ties in, I think, to Wendila's question. As you go forward with your research, what other variables will you be considering? Because it's probably reasonable to assume that a landlocked country like Mali or Central African Republic, which I know one of those is not an Afrobarometer study, but they may have different perspectives on, say, the island countries like Madagascar.
Right? So in the data, right? So when we did, I presented this in the order that we explored this. Yeah, let's say, right? And so when we first looked at this, right, and it was fewer countries at the time, right? You know, I mean, a country like Lesotho, right, that is landlocked. I'm not a South African. Good. I'm not a South African. But I teach it, so I shouldn't know. No, Lesotho is landlocked, right? So there is probably a story there, right? Why people in Lesotho are very much pro-free movement. They live in a landlocked country, right? But for some reason, they're actually not so much for free trade, right? Because they probably think all that economic opportunity that the South Africans gain from free trade, right? We're losing, right? So there are stories there, right? And I think if we were to explore this, I think you would basically have to dive into those countries, right? And you probably have to compare it with a similarly sized small non-landlocked countries, and you would do a qualitative analysis. I don't, because I think my hunch is that there's just not enough, and that's not even true, not enough landlocked countries in the sample where you could actually do a comparative analysis. But definitely there's also Eswatini in there, right? Which is also, I think, interesting because, well, it's just very different than Lesotho, right? It's very pro-free trade, very pro-free free movement. And I haven't even, in this, but I've just used to sort of haphazardly respond to your question. You know, the answer here. I haven't even talked about the policy position yet, right? Because if you look at Lesotho and let's look at Lesotho and Eswatini, right? Eswatini is here in terms of free movement. Eswatini is here in terms of free movement, right? So not very integrative, right? And in terms of free trade, is actually quite open. Sort of the mirror image of what the people want. Right? So there's something to unpack there for sure in terms of landlocked countries. What other variables are we looking at? So we work our way down from the variables that we think are the biggest drivers, right? And so the hypotheses that because you can come up with 100 different explanations, right? But what you would have to convince me of, you know, as a good social scientist, is that they matter more than, positively speaking, right, than what we're already looking at, right? And I'm not saying being landlocked is not one of those reasons, but I would need a good story, like a good narrative, a good causal mechanism description, right, for why that reason, being landlocked, right, is more important than being a democracy and being dependent on sort of taxation, right? It's sort of similar to this a little bit, right? Because you're dependent on outside countries' goodwill in a way as a landlocked countries, and that's something we have thought about and that we haven't really incorporated yet. And it would blow my mind right now to think about this. But your policy is probably also driven by your neighbor's policy. So Lesotho's policy is probably more driven by South Africa's policy than it is by Nigeria's policy. So that's something to consider, you know, but I can't do it right now. Good point.
Okay, let's continue this with this.
Hello, thank you so much for presenting a piece of your research. Sounds really interesting.
You should introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Okay, my name is Sumaya. I'm a first-year Maya student, and I'm Sudanese American. I was wondering if you guys have considered adding another lens, kind of like Christy, someone would have to argue it, but maybe also like a decolonial and cultural context. Because for me, when I thought about the first thing that came to mind when I thought about, oh, seems like there's overwhelmingly more liberal trade desire by governments rather than people. First thing I thought of was, well, you know, we live in a post-colonial world, but we see all these the post-colonial sentiment remains very, very strong, and decolonial movements are, you know, stirring up more and more and more. So we see all, you know, with Niger, Burkina Faso, France, etc. So we see all these sentiments from civil society and people that are very strongly anti-West, anti-Europe. So the first thing I thought of is maybe that's, even though trade is it helps economies grow, but perhaps a lot of these actual civilians and citizens really feel like, well, we don't want that state or those states as our trade partners. So for me, the first thing I thought of is kind of like that decolonial and cultural lens. And another thing that I thought was interesting, because I had done some research before on Arabization and the impact of Arabization in Africa and its double destruction of identity, of African identity and state. And although you did mention that ethnic, you didn't say conflict, but ethnic partner relations perhaps didn't affect decisions as much,
Right.
or etc. It made me think of how, for example, with Sudan or Arabophone African states or Somalia, Sudan and Somalia are part of the Arab League. And we know that even before the split of the northern part of Sudan and South Sudan, there was, and there still is, lots of waves of this de-Arabization. Maybe less now in Sudan because they're kind of, the north part of Sudan is still engulfed in this Arabized identity, but I know it still exists because I'm a part of it. And also because even before the North-South split, all the indigenous tribes of Sudan, including from the south and the north and the Nubians and people of the Fur and etc., they rejected this Arabized identity. So it makes me wonder, like, all the Arabization policies of the 60s in Sudan and the Arabophone African states, and even the changing of the former indigenous Sudanese flag to the current one that matches the Arab states, including all the foreign policy decisions that include trade and partnership with the Arab states, even though they're being exploited, even though they're exploiting African ones. I feel like, at least in that case, it really makes a difference. So perhaps it would be case by case, depending on the different countries, but I don't think it should be totally shut out, because I don't think we can look at a lot of things on the African continent without really considering the strength of the remaining anti-colonization sentiments, because it still shapes, I think, it penetrates every part of African society. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Oh, great question. I think my co-author Samira would high-five you on the second point, because she has made this point, sort of a similar point before. Yeah, I'm very glad that they cannot chime in, so I can sort of mention them. They're listening in. But I'll respond to the first question first. Yeah, they're both really good questions. First, I thought your question was going somewhere else, because this is a comparative paper on Africa, trying to explain things across different countries, and not once have we mentioned colonial pasts, right? There may be, you know, when I present this paper to like the sort of African studies crowds, right, that's something that comes up, right? They think, well, have you not considered that differently colonized countries have different trade relations, right? At different understandings of trade, for instance, right? And I have to admit that this comes up every time we discuss in this paper, because it feels like something that is missing in the analysis, but it is not clear to me what the immediate causal mechanism is. Right? I have not convinced myself of a mechanism that I find more important than the ones that we're looking at. And that doesn't mean there's not something going on, and maybe it's just too complex for me to consider, right? But so that's just and that is the coloniality, not the decoloniality, right? That's where I thought your question was going to, right? So now I just responded to my own question while I responded to yours. But the second one, right, the first question, the actual first question that you asked is also very interesting. And I think this is probably happening in that democracy finding that we have, right? Because what's probably happening is that African populations are actually quite trade critical as opposed to their governments. And their governments are pressured, incentivized to go into trade agreements with international organizations that come with certain conditions, right? And maybe their populations are, what you're saying, they just sort of have more of a critical view on trade. Definitely, it seems like that, right? So that's where that gap is coming from for those democracies that are oversupplying free trade, right? And a finding that I didn't present, sort of a side finding, is that when we look at different, those different professions, whether you work in agriculture, whether you're a trader, we also look at students, okay? And students in Africa, across the continent, seem to be particularly mismatched in terms of what the governments want, right? So I think that decolonial dynamic, right, happens with educated, or people who are currently educating themselves, right? And that is interesting for the future of those trade agreements, right? I don't think these are people that are at the moment driving the policy clearly of the governments, but they are, I started this presentation by saying people power is increasing, right? And these are the people that are probably most dynamic and mobilized, right? So I think it's an excellent point. And the de-Arabization, it's sort of similar to an idea that there is sort of blocks, right? So what you're saying is there are certain countries that may have similar trade policies, similar public opinion based on those dynamics going on. And so you would have to do an analysis of a subsample, because I don't think, well, you correct me if I'm wrong, that this is something that there's a parallel process like this going on in Namibia. You know what I mean? Those are a particular set of countries where this is happening. But you could sort of control for that probably, and look at the subsample and see whether these countries and where they are oriented towards, right? So if there's a group of countries that are more oriented towards Arab countries, which, by the way, trade-wise makes total geographic sense also, right? It may make cultural sense, but it may also make total geographic sense, right? That's something that we could look at. Again, like, I'm a bit puzzled by whether this would be something that we'd consider across the whatever 54 countries that we're looking at, or whether it's 32 for us, or whether you just zoom into a couple of countries and see whether this is driving it. This is a good point.
Thank you. By the way, I mean, one thing on the colonial issue, which is very interesting in this regard, is that now I think China's exports to Africa are about the same level, if not higher, about $150 billion a year as the entire EU, including number of colonial powers. So that would complicate the calculus. Who's exploiting those countries, so to speak?
Right, because I did a bit of a magic trick in this presentation, right? Because I basically said, look what social scientists do, right? They always talk about external donors or external powers determining foreign policy, right? And then I said, that's outdated, but then I never came back to it, right? But obviously it is an influential, there must be an influence there, right? So what we haven't done, and that's actually the next step, I think, this sort of goes to your question as well. The next step, we have to sort of throw that back into the analysis, right? And see, like, okay, so now we see these sort of very domestic factors and how they drive the match between foreign policy and public opinion. But really, I think it's relatively straightforward to sort of think about mechanisms that could be just as important as the ones that we're testing, where international actors say, well, look, this should be your position. Or where international actors, in fact, try to educate populations to understand that free trade is beneficial to them. Right? You can put a value on this. You can not make a normative statement about it, but that's what we do. That's what Western countries do. They try to often educate populations that free trade is beneficial. Right. And so I am criticizing that this is the usual perspective that we're taking, and we're sort of actively saying we're ignoring that for a while, right? But the moment I would send this out for review, and this recording is no problem now, but the moment that we send this out for review, I am pretty sure that a reviewer would come back to me and say, yeah, okay, all fine, right? I'm glad that you've looked at this now, but now tell me whether the exact criticism the exact point that I made earlier, right? Is this really more important, what you're looking at here, then if the World Bank says, well, sorry, or if the IMF says this is the policy, and the governments are like, all right, so this is,
Interesting.
and I don't have an answer.
All right, let's continue over there.
Hi, Daria, also first year Maya student, and I have two questions. The first one is regarding your data. And I was wondering in general whether you were concerned, I don't exactly know how the Afrobarometer works, were you concerned with selection bias, especially so how for respondents, and did you only use data where people responded to both policy questions, or where people were disregarded if they didn't respond to foreign policy at all? That's the first one, and I guess that also links back to education. And my second one was, I might be mistaken, but I thought that in hypothesis 3, it says that the city was actually underrepresented as a group, or was it overrepresented?
I think we didn't say in particular, we just said we basically just said it could be that urban populations are differently affected than, differently powerful. I think it was in the fourth, was it? Let me just check this. But I don't think we explicitly said this directionally. Let's see. Yeah, urban versus rural, that's what you're referring to?
No, I think the third hypothesis. Or maybe I'm wrong.
No, it might be that I was mentioning it.
No, then maybe I thought that the urban respondents were underrepresented.
So I'll say this.
Yeah.
It almost doesn't matter what I say in the hypothesis as long as I test it afterwards, right? So whether to me.
Oh no, I didn't mean it. Sorry, I meant the effects. Could you go to effects?
To
really
the effects.
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Okay. Right. And that can be here, but I don't know why I put this under H3 because it should be under H4. Because obviously because I used this this should actually be on this slide.
Okay, my question was, they have a worse match, and then we just talked about education, how that would make the likeliness of a higher match more likely. So I was wondering what your hunch is, why they have a worse match for.
So this
policy.
this is a really excellent question. I think here I've really paraphrased a very complex finding where like it's both in trade and for the free movement. Urban populations seem to be doing something really weird. So don't really feel comfortable saying either or. Yeah. But it's sort of I can show you the finding in detail later if you're interested, right? And we haven't wrapped our head around yet, really. It's just that this is one of the sort of partial findings. The other question that you asked on the Afrobarometer. Again, I give you two answers. Right? One is, so it's an interesting point to ask: have they responded to both questions? We have not looked at that because we're just treating them separately at this point. Right? But I can see where your point sort of goes, which is like, well, maybe it's almost like there may be people who are particularly prone to have an opinion on those things and people who don't, right? And so maybe people who have opinions on both things, but say don't know on one, right, are different people. Yeah, interesting. I have to think about that a bit more. But the other answer that I give you is a much more practical question, right? So we have to sort of trust the Afrobarometer, right? Because it's the only data that we have.
And do you trust it?
Yeah, I think they're great. They're really great people. Now they're doing this. Yeah, it's a massive endeavor. Right? Do I trust the Eurobarometer? Do I trust the Arab barometer? They all exist, right? I've collected. As a researcher, right, together with teams in Uganda, for instance, I have collected survey data with like 1,300 households in northern Uganda. Yeah, it's not pretty how that is made, yeah? because it's very difficult to get to certain places. There's a lot of attrition. There's a lot of people who and so you have to record that, right? And the Afrobarometer has become increasingly better, and they're definitely the best in doing it, right? So I trust them to the extent that I also understand that the endeavor is really difficult. Right? So no, it's not. I'm just saying, like, do I trust them? I work with what I have because otherwise we would not have anything. Right? And I also think the collection of data in the field anywhere is so costly, right, and so difficult, and they definitely have thought very carefully. They have, if you go to the Afrobarometer website, on each survey round, they have a methodological toolbook and training book of the enumerators, and it's like several hundred pages long. And you should read that. It's very interesting, very instructive about how data is collected, right? And I think what you're sort of getting at a little bit is also that I'm presenting this data to you, but it comes from somewhere, right? Somebody went to the house, knocked on the door, and said, "Let's sit down for like an hour and a half, because these questionnaires are long, right?" And ask you those questions, right? And then you ask something. One of those questions is, well, what do you think about free trade? And that's the 66th question. Yeah, that's right. I have no good answer to you, but to say like, well, I'm glad the question is in there because I can do this analysis now. Yeah. But it's very, you know, if you ever get to work for a server company, you should do it. It's very instructive. It's very instructive on how many people say no to you. Like, I'm a social scientist, and I should say yes to every time I've been asked for a survey, I should say yes, right? Because I rely on people, and I'm not going to tell you how many times I say no, because I don't have time, I'm not in the mood, right? Because I don't trust the people who are calling me, right? And because I would totally bias the survey because I know how they work. Right?
Okay, over. Yes, next question. We've got time for maybe one more question, or a couple more questions.
Hello, I'm Oscar. I'm from the Maya program. Thank you for your lecture. I wanted to ask you something a bit more like on the news. So how did your research affect, especially regarding the countries that were recently affected by recent coups by the military, affected your views, basically? Because you said before how, I don't know, like, I didn't really see which dates you got this data from, but one of your hypotheses that you also mentioned before was how many times maybe the opinion of the people and of the government is completely different. And, you know, we've been seeing on the news how in these countries where there have been these military coups, have been a lot of protests in favor of like Russia and against France, like Samaya was saying, and against the West. So I was just wondering what were your views on that and how your research basically affected your views on this current situation. Thank you.
Thanks. Excellent question. I had a very so when I drafted this presentation, I presented this a lot of times, yeah? But recently there have been so many coups accumulating that I felt like I couldn't escape the news. And so I had a very courageous point on my first slide about this, and then I looked at it again this morning. I was like, nah. I'm just not. I don't know anything about this, yeah, and because that's not what I researched. So and I guess my intuition wasn't so wrong, because obviously you're right. You're asking because that's going on. Yeah. The point that you're making is kind of interesting to me, and I think we have to incorporate that to some extent, which is that maybe you just, you know, on the 66th question that you're being asked in the survey, right? There's also just been a military coup, and you hate this government. And so you just disagree. They're not really asked to disagree with the government anyway, so, right? They're asked to say something about free trade. But so there could be, what you're saying is there could be sort of something that drives public opinion, right? Based on the coup that's been happening, right? Or like, because it's not really disagreement with the government. Now the question is, can I think about a pathway by which a coup affects distance in what the current government wants to what the people want? And I think I can, because, you know, if the government has changed relatively quickly, right, then does that policy still apply even, right? And in fact, right, what you look when you don't just take the ARI, the African Regional Integration Index, for granted, which has to do, for instance, with have these governments ratified certain agreements, but you actually look at the practice on whether those ratified agreements are actually being implemented, whether people can cross the border freely. The answer is no, right? So very often. And so I think there is something to it that there could be if there was a change of government in that period, right, that could affect the gap. I think that's right. How often that happened between 2019 and 2021, right? And to what extent, right? By the way, as I said before, that time period is a very particular time period, right? So the COVID pandemic, I haven't mentioned at all. I mean, I was referring to it when I said this is a very particular time period, but like that could also be driving some of those ideas about free trade and free movement, right? Because if you're in lockdown, you may have a very particular view on free movement, right? As opposed to when you're not in lockdown. Just reflected on the slide.
Mm.
But, yes.
We have legitimized itself with the fact that we're not in the government.
I don't know whether, look, there's such different coups, right? I find it very difficult to compare them. I think that's my personal view. Yeah? I think in the media the media is very quick on saying, look at all these coups. I think they're to some extent they're the same dynamic, but they're the same disease, whatever, the same thing, but they're different dynamics underlying them, right? International actors like to see, I think that's fair to say, they like to see constant leadership, right? Especially in terms of free trade, because that's, we want stability, right? So I think in that sense, there's a bit of a problem there, right? Have they legitimized themselves? Well, if you come with a gun, it sounds pretty legitimate to me, in that if I'm but if I'm the citizen, right? It's like, it's sort of like, that's how I would probably react, right? But in secret, right, or whatever, in my household, I may have very different opinions.
All right, folks, we got to wrap up now, unfortunately. So I will leave it at this. Florian, once again, thank you so much for making it. I think we've had a wonderful presentation and learned a lot about Africa, certainly not to generalize about it. I think there is a hidden bombshell in your presentation about, in particular, this question of authoritarian governments being more responsive to the public opinion than democratic governments. I'll have to think about that. In any case, I think this was a wonderful presentation. I would like everyone to join me once again in thanking Florian Kern. Thank you.
Good question. Good questions.
Oh, this crowd.
It's my crowd. It's my crowd. My crowd.
So